why our members really loved it at OPTECH was I think it's using tech to find new ways to deliver insights and that they desperately are looking for.
There's this systematic unreliability of the data that you get from surveys, because if I put 10 questions in front of you, I've made an implicit assumption that you are equally interested in all 10 of the things that I'm asking you about. And that simply isn't the case. You're probably interested in 2 or 3 things, which means that 7 or 8 answers to the questions are relatively low quality.
A key learning here that we continue to see every time we do something like this is when you let the resident lead the conversation, and it's something that they're genuinely interested in engaging with, you often get engagement rates that are much, much higher than the traditional survey.
Welcome to a bonus edition of Tech Talk with 20 for 20. This episode is going to be a little bit different. What you're about to see or hear is a presentation that was recorded on the release of a new piece of research on AI-driven sentiment analysis. The study itself debuted at OPTECH 2025, and it explores a question that sounds simple but turns out not to be. How do multifamily residents actually feel about Wi-Fi? To unpack it, I'm joined by my 2 collaborators in the research, Kevin Donnelly, the Executive Director and Chief Advocacy Officer at RETTC, and Arjun Kannan, who is the co-founder of ResiDesk, a company focused on AI-driven sentiment analysis. What makes this work extra interesting is not just the findings, but the approach. Instead of relying on traditional surveys, this research uses AI to drive real resident conversations. So Wi-Fi really becomes the lens through which we understand sentiment analysis. In the presentation, we talk through the methodology. We talk about why it produces different insights from survey-based approaches. We dig into the results, many of which surprised us, and we step back to discuss what kinds of analysis like this mean for the industry more broadly, including how operators can act on it. We close with recommendations and next steps. The full research is available for download at the 20 for 20 website. And with that, here it is. What multifamily residents really think about Wi-Fi. Okay, well, thank you for joining us. Let's dive straight into the meat of the presentation. And let's start off by talking about why we are studying both these 2 objectives, really this idea of understanding how AI helps sentiment analysis and also what that enables us to find out about Wi-Fi. So we'll start off with a little bit of an origin story of this study. It really came out of something that we've been doing over the last couple of years with RETTC. For me, I got interested in this whole area of connectivity a couple of years ago. I started going to sessions at conferences, and I sort of realized that there's probably a bit of a gap between the deep technical understanding of Wi-Fi and connectivity and the kind of business drivers behind it. But as we studied this for OPTECH in 2024, we did an initial paper about the state of connectivity. Something that really kind of came to the fore was that we don't know that much about what people actually think about connectivity. We certainly know that it matters when people don't like it. We certainly know the reasons why people implement it in their buildings in the first place. But what people feel about Wi-Fi and all these things that differentiate the various types of Wi-Fi that are out there, that is pretty poorly understood in the industry. And we saw this opportunity to use AI-driven research to throw some light on this need area. Kevin, this has been a super interesting collaboration so far. What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having us. It's really good to be here from RETTC's perspective. I think the partnership here really is galvanized in a need for more information. I think from the owner operator community as well as the tech partners that our members collaborate with to deploy connectivity. We've had limited data to really tell us what is needed in the market. I think that there's a lot of consumer knowledge about the importance of connectivity or broadband and even Wi-Fi more specifically as of late. And sometimes that doesn't line up with the development realities or the pricing. There's a lot of big question marks. So I think one of the reasons why we love this partnership and this collaboration is building upon that knowledge set so that owners and operators are approaching providers with the right questions and,
Mhm.
are really trying to, at the end of the day, serve their residents best. And I think it's done through data and true knowledge, and that's what this project is. So we
Mm.
appreciate the collaboration.
And Arjun, before we dive into the details of the study, what can you say from your perspective about the why of all this?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. Excited to speak to, how we think about sentiment. This mirrors very closely how we think about what we're solving at ResiDesk as well, which has always been. It's actually quite hard to understand how people feel about the things that we're doing, and importantly, when they feel good or bad about an amenity or service that our customers provide, owners or operators. It's all equally hard to understand how much of that is signal and how much of that is noise, right? Like I might complain about something at my apartment every day, but I that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to me not renewing my lease or being a bad resident or being a good resident. And so to us, this was a great chance to partner and actually test something that we've been trying to build out for a while, which is the idea of sentiment, which is instead of sending people 100 questions over email and expecting them to answer them at their leisure. Most people don't answer most of those questions, and there's no guarantee that all those questions are equally important to everybody. We
Mhm.
instead do it the way that our best property managers do, right? And this is something all of our customers say. The best properties have the best property managers who talk to residents, have a human conversation, and come back with a real idea of what matters to the residents so they can make good decisions about what to invest in or not.
Yeah.
And so our goal here was to see how we could scale that across multiple units, multiple states. And this was a great opportunity to do so. Wi-Fi has obviously been a massive topic over the last couple of years. Internet connectivity is, regardless of whether you think about it as a utility or an amenity, it's a basic need for most of us. That's how
Mhm.
we do our work. And so
Mhm.
this was a perfect chance to sort of tackle something that was sort of a great test bed for something that's hot in the regulatory side of things, something that really matters to our owner and operator partners, and something that we can actually bring a new approach to and create value. So really excited to be part of this, excited to be here.
Cool. Well, let's dive into what we did. And one of the first things to understand, you sort of touched on it a moment ago there. There are actually good reasons why we don't know that much about this stuff. It's mostly because this is difficult information to find out. If we think about our lenses that we currently have into sentiment, they're mostly information that we get from surveys, right? So the idea is in order to find out sentiment, we're going to manufacture some information by putting a survey in front of a resident. And based on what that information tells us, we're going to make some draw some conclusions about how residents feel about stuff. Um, there are some systematic flaws in the survey model that we think AI is very, very well positioned to solve. And I've summarized them on this slide here. The first thing is that questionnaires are rigid, right? Like what questionnaires really do is they sort of assess people's answer to a question that you formulated. So everything about a questionnaire rests on whether or not you asked the right question, and it's very difficult to know whether you did or not until after the results are in, and even then, right? So you've got a rigid structure for the question. It may or may not speak to something that I think as a resident, and I can only answer it in one way. It's usually you can answer on a scale of 1 to 5, or you can check a box, or something like that. Now, here I'll state some of my own priors here, as most of my listeners will know. Each year I publish this survey, this 20 for 20 survey, which is based on 20 interviews with senior leaders in multifamily. The reason I do that rather laborious thing every year is that I don't think you can find out what people think about technology through any format other than conversation in multifamily. Multifamily is too fragmented. The businesses are all too different from one another. If you can't ask people why they did what they did, you can't really understand, make any sense of the decisions that get made. So for me, I've been on board the whole idea of using conversation to get at sentiment for a long time. And the reason for that is that conversations enable you to ask open-ended questions. When you ask open-ended questions, people can answer them, interpret them, answer them in the words of their choosing in a way that they can't with a survey. And that's where most of the information is in this. Obviously, what AI brings to the table is a way to scale up conversation into something that you can do with tens of thousands of people, as we did in this study. You also sort of touched on the respondent experience here as well. One of the reasons why you have something of a cap on the response rate you can get from a survey is that, when you get a survey, you generally don't want to answer it, right? It's a chore. You can incentivize people to answer it, but that then sort of starts to skew the respondent says. A much better solution to that problem is to ask people one thing at a time. If you get a text message saying, hey, Kevin, can I ask you a question about your Wi-Fi? You may or may not answer that, but it's a low friction thing for you to do that. And the AI is smart enough to know whether your response tells it that it should ask you another question or whether you're done, right? Stick a pin in that because we're going to come back to that in a second. And the final point on here, and I hadn't really appreciated this until we started to look at the results of this particular study, is there's this systematic unreliability of the data that you get from surveys. Because if I put 10 questions in front of you, I've made an implicit assumption that you are equally interested in all 10 of the things that I'm asking you about. And that simply isn't the case. You're probably interested in 2 or 3 things, which means that 7 or 8 answers to the questions are relatively low quality. But the thing is, there's no way of weeding that out of survey data. When I look at responses to 10 questions, I don't know which ones really mattered to people and which ones didn't based on the responses. Now, the thing that we're going to talk about next is that the AI is smart enough to allow the respondent to guide the research instrument towards whatever they are the most interested in. In our 2 out of 10 questions in the survey, we're going to ignore the 8 things that you're not interested in, and we're going to go as deep as we possibly can on the 2 that you do, because that way you actually get information that's reliable. Did I miss anything, Arjun, just from the methodology so far?
No, that's perfect. I think something I'll add there is just what I appreciated in us doing this and your framing of it is this is actually, I think, the first time we can build a survey methodology that is built for the person answering the questions as opposed to the person asking the questions,
Yeah.
right? It's very easy for me to ask 10 questions at once. That's the only way I can scale it. But the best companies in the world, this is how they do product research. And so in some ways, this is very new. And in many other ways, it's actually a very old best practice that we now have the ability to scale with AI. So that's the part that's been extremely exciting about it.
Cool. All right. Well, let's talk about how this works. And I think the easiest way to think about this is the AI is set up to do what a good person-to-person conversation does. If you're having a conversation with somebody, I read whether or not you're interested in what I'm saying, or at least I should do, and that guides where the conversation goes. And essentially, that's what the AI is doing here. So again, rather than having our list of 10 questions that you would in a survey, you're instead using this structure of anchor and follow-up questions. So the first question that I ask you is mostly intended to figure out whether or not you are interested, you are engaged in this topic. If you are, the follow-up questions go deeper and deeper and deeper into the into whatever the subject matter is. If you don't respond, or if you give a cursory kind of response, or the AI does not get a signal that you are engaged on this topic, it will move on to a different question. And critically, again, because when we think of surveys, they're usually sort of one-shot things. You send out one survey at one time and you have one opportunity to answer it. Because this is a conversation that runs through text, this can play out over a long period, right? This research period was like 90 days. So the gap between asking an anchor question and asking another anchor question can be days, even weeks. So that you've got the opportunity to catch somebody with something they're interested in whenever they're interested in talking to you about it. What this process produces is a massive amount of words, right? So rather than having a load of averages that or response numbers from people's responses to a survey, you just have a colossal amount of words, which up to recently have been very difficult to do anything with. But one of the things that we know about AI is it's very, very good at understanding the sense of what words are telling it. It's very good at, for example, organizing people into cohorts based on having similar feelings that they've expressed during the course of the conversation. Arjun, one thing before I move on to the example that I want to share.
Mhm.
What were some of the findings about the depth of questions of responses that people that people went into?
Yeah, so that was really interesting. So, you touched on it in the previous slide. Because you're asking fewer questions, you assume that there's a cap on how much information you can get from an approach like this. That would be the sort of naive assumption. What we actually found out is once you start getting people talking about the things that really do matter to them, well over half of our conversations had people engaging in at least three back and forth conversations. And these are really like people pouring out their feelings, right? They're not just yes, no, or 1 to 5.
Mhm.
And astonishingly, I think there were a bunch of conversations where people went really ham, right? Like they went like 20, 30 conversations deep. So I think a key learning here that we continue to see every time we do something like this is when you let the resident lead the conversation, and it's something that they're genuinely interested in engaging with, you often get engagement rates that are much, much higher than the traditional survey. And we weren't budgeting for 20 questions.
Mhm.
We were budgeting for maybe like we'd get 2 or 3 responses. So that was a pleasant surprise to us.
Mhm.
And it shows how strongly people feel about the topic.
Yeah, no, it's it certainly dispels the idea that people are completely indifferent to their Wi-Fi.
Yep.
All right, so the last thing I want to say about methodology, I want to use an example that you're going to see comes up again and again during the results that we got. One of the things that we are very strongly trying to focus on here is you want to figure out what matters about sentiments, right? Not only what do people think about things, but what can I do or what should I do as a result of the way people feel about things? And the best way to do that is to try and understand the relationship between the thing that we're measuring, like a sentiment to Wi-Fi, and commercial outcomes. And once a resident is in a building, the most important commercial outcome that there is whether or not they're going to renew their lease. Now, anyone who reads my stuff knows that I'm a massive skeptic of anything that claims to improve retention rates. Most people move house for life reasons, but there is some cohort of people that are persuadable within a building who are on the fence about whether or not they're going to renew. Therefore, it is useful if you're going to invest a lot of money in a really good amenity for a community to understand if it has anything, that cohort has any particular resonance with the thing that you're investing the money in. Now, if we're trying to find out something like how does your community's Wi-Fi affect your likelihood to renew, we tend to ask that question exactly as I just stated it, right, as we've written here. And if you think about asking somebody a question like that, that's a huge, huge abstraction, right? To get somebody to say, well, that's a question that's about whether or not I'm going to renew. It's a question about whether or not I care about my Wi-Fi. It's a question about whether or not I like it. It's a question about whether or not that has anything to do with my plans to move house. Like that, you're asking about an enormous number of things in one question. So the information that you're going to get from that might give you some kind of an indicator of like salience, but it's going to give you extremely unreliable data regarding the question that you're actually asking. A much better way to do that, because that question is asking about two things that may or may not have anything to do with one another, a really good way to answer that question is to ask the two questions completely separately or explore the two topics completely separately. And so the way that we did this over the 90 days that this research ran is we had two different sets of conversations that were running. One was the stuff that we have described about how people feel about Wi-Fi. And the other was this kind of check-in series of questions about renewals. and we had access to sufficient outcome data during the period that we measured. Like we know enough about the decisions people ultimately made, that we have a pretty accurate model that predicts whether or not somebody is high or low probability to renew. You're going to see some results that relate to this in a moment. So just keep that in mind. The AI is both creating cohorts of how likely somebody is to renew their lease, and it's creating cohorts of how people feel about their Wi-Fi. And the thing you're then doing is looking for patterns of correlation between those two things. So although we don't claim that correlation is causation, right? It doesn't mean that because someone feels a certain way about their Wi-Fi, they're going to make a certain decision. But if you have, for example, high correlation between one cohort and another, that implies a level of business risk that everybody should be aware of, because you're looking at correlation between two highly reliable pieces of information. Okay, so that's all we want to say about the methodology. Before we dive into the results part of the presentation, I'd love to take a step back and contextualize this particular domain in the context of bigger topics in the industry, particularly regulation. And I'd love to bring Kevin in here as well, who's had a great deal of experience and I'd say a lot of success over the last year or two in this area with helping the industry, push against some of this regulation. But the way I'll tee it up is this, right? It's generally the case that people whether it's a local government or a federal agency, the general tone is that we try to break up anything that looks like a monopoly. There's this it's very deep in the DNA of regulators that breaking up telecom related monopolies leads to good consumer outcomes, which means that we tend to approach hostilely anything that looks like a monopoly. Now, what we know about the technologies that we're putting into buildings is that the benefit of having single providers in a single building is it significantly increases the quality of Wi-Fi in that building. Therefore, one of the useful things that we can understand through the research that we've been doing here is what is the relationship between, whether I have multiple providers or a single provider, like the quality of the Wi-Fi and the way residents think about it, because that feels to us like an area that's a bit unrepresented in a lot of the regulatory conversations. Kevin, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that regulation does impact how our members, the housing operators, are approaching deployment. And I think you're right in pointing to at least legacy policy actions that have preferred what we call consumer choice. And the reality is we've seen consumer choice works well if you're in a luxury Class A property. Now, there are technical reasons why we think that there are limitations in that environment as well. But by and large, the market more broadly is well served when you have competition that can lead to robust, reliable broadband. And in many cases, that is with a single provider, or it is with a legacy provider, and you have a independent or a smaller managed Wi-Fi provider coming on site that is providing better, more affordable or superior service than what the legacy provider is willing to do, whether they're willing to upgrade or not. And this is a conversation we've been having with policymakers for as long as I've been in this real estate tech space, 10 plus years, where we've had to show them through data that residents want, through survey methodology outside of this report, but that show residents want immediate access to connectivity the moment they walk in the door of their new home. And to do that, the best way for us to do that is really through managed Wi-Fi or bulk billing solutions, where you remove barriers to access, you remove barriers to adoption, And in many ways, you remove barriers to deployment from the provider side and from the housing operator side. So we have been pushing policymakers to embrace this solution, this single provider solution, really as the step forward, leverage it to improve digital outcomes across the rental housing landscape. And I think this survey that, you guys, or this methodology that you're talking about today really demonstrates that it's critical that we deliver higher levels of resident satisfaction via connectivity.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we had talked about last year, which was really, I mean, 2024 was very active on the advocacy front, as I recall. But I think one of the ideas that we had talked about is that um, regulators tend to have the wrong definition of consumer choice. Like they define choice in terms of the number of service providers that are available to a resident. But the thing that the resident seems increasingly to be choosing is the services that the Wi-Fi enables. That's how properties differentiate themselves increasingly. And because more and more of those services depend on really solid, reliable Wi-Fi, they're kind of a lot of the regulation sort of misses the point of what consumer choice really is becoming.
Yeah, I 100%. I think the lack of understanding of the, I would say, multifamily broadband market more broadly, but in particular, the new technologies in the market that are best serving residents is pretty stark. The conversations we have to have with policymakers at all levels of government, explaining what is managed Wi-Fi, what is bulk broadband. Um, they're elementary in many ways, but I think it just shows the collective importance of us all getting this message out there, is that residents are best served in these environments, and not just residents. We have to look at, behind the walls, what's happening that policymakers sometimes are demanding, right? Improve sustainability or resilience, operate far better under a umbrella of a managed Wi-Fi system or a bulk system than it does in this choice model. And I think that's, sometimes connecting those dots for policymakers is really important. But I will say 2024, we had our hands full at the federal level. We had a significant challenge to bulk and managed Wi-Fi. And we were successful earlier this year, seeing the FCC back down once again and repeal or remove a proceeding from their docket that would have really upended this model that allows for managed Wi-Fi or modern delivery of connectivity to residents. And despite that win, we're now seeing efforts spread across the country in state legislatures or in local governments that, while well-intended at the front end, trying to promote consumer choice, ultimately undermines the bulk and managed Wi-Fi model and can disrupt not just the resident experience, but also, just the broader adoption and use of broadband, especially in sensitive communities.
Mhm.
And worse, really impacts the long-term viability of that property from an operations standpoint. All of those systems we talked about, the leak detection, the HVAC monitoring, energy efficiency devices, they all start to fall apart if that network is not reliable. And that's where I think policymakers sometimes go into this with the wrong understanding of not just the models in place that are increasingly popular to serve residents, but
Mhm.
it's also just this perception of, consumer choice at all cost is the best route to go. And that's sometimes their actions from a policy standpoint actually undermine that exact goal.
Exactly. Okay, well, we're going to go to a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about the results and we will talk about how they apply to everything you just said, Kevin. I hope you're enjoying this presentation about what multifamily residents think about Wi-Fi. Remember, this is important not only because Wi-Fi is important, but it's also important from the perspective that AI is changing the way that we can understand sentiment. For that reason, it's a really good idea to download the full report, which gives you detailed insight into the methodology that we used. You can download a free copy from the 20 for 20 website at 20for20.com/publications, or click the link in the show notes. Now, back to the show. All right, so Arjun, let's talk about the results.
Awesome. Um, All right. So the way that we've broken up the results here, and you'll see more in the white paper as well, is sort of threefold, right? One is, does Wi-Fi matter to residents? Next is, if so, how does it matter? And then, and third, if it does matter, then what is good and bad, and then what can you do about it? But before we get into any of that, when you get into a new methodology like this, really for any survey, but especially for a new methodology like this, I think the first thing to talk about is how do we know that our data set and the folks that we spoke to are actually sort of a meaningful sample of the market, right? Because you can, if you make your data set narrow enough, you can confirm almost anything. Just talk to the one person who thinks that K-pop Demon Hunters should win the Oscars this year, and you'll get 100% win rate. And so for us, it was incredibly important to have a set of residents that actually represent the US market. And so what you'll see on this slide, we go into much more detail in the white paper, is just all the effort that we took to make that happen, right? So this was over 30,000 units across 11 states. That's over 240 properties. This was, as also you were saying before, Dom, a study that we ran over a period of 90 days. So we could actually have multiple chances to interact with them. And we took great care to make sure that this is a representative mix from every angle possible, right? We have every class of property represented in here, every type of building, mid-rise, high-rise, garden style. We had residents, who had been in their units for less than a month. We had residents who had been in their units for well over a decade. We had a great mix of urban, suburban, and ex-urban markets. And also, much more importantly, to Kevin's point, we actually have a representative mix of residents who have managed and bulk sort of services in their property versus folks who have just pure retail choice. All of which to say, when we learn what we learn from our residents, we can actually be quite reasonably confident that what they're saying represents what we believe to be true across the broader market, which is what makes all of our findings that much more valuable. So in that vein, we'll talk about what the findings are. So, question number one, as we were talking about, is does Wi Fi matter? Right. And the reason we ask this question is it's actually really important, as we'll also discuss in a bit at the conclusion stage, to check our priors. Right. I would say the opinion of the industry, depending on who you talk to, is quite split in terms of is Wi Fi a utility, meaning that it's just something that people expect or an amenity, meaning it is something that we care about and can actually market to our residents and create value from. Um, and that actually influences our behavior in terms of how we think about the investment into it and how it actually creates the product we want for our residents. And so to us, the first thing to understand is how do residents feel about Wi-Fi across the things that we think are important to them. You'll see here we actually look to break down a number of preconceptions about what good service actually means, right? The average sort of feeling on the street is that you know people talk about Wi-Fi speed and that faster is always better, and that is roughly true. But what our residents actually say is it needs to be fast enough, right? Like we tend to talk about it in terms of 600 versus 900 megabits. And for residents, it's just, can I get on my video call? Can I stream, whatever my kids want to watch? Um, the next thing that was really interesting is we talk about customer service quite a bit, right? Again, like we tend to go with partners that provide the best customer service. But in reality, most residents don't want to call anybody. They don't actually want to be on the phone with customer support. What they care about is reliability, right? And it was very interesting, but probably not surprising at all, how often customer support was called out only in negative sense, right? Like it's a pain avoidance measure. I don't want to call Xfinity, not to name names, but I don't want to call my retail provider. I don't want to call my site manager. I just want things to work or need to know like when it's going to be back when it doesn't work. Another thing that was really interesting, we talk about a lot of things in terms of, the premium features that we offer, right? Like there's a lot of industry talk devoted to things like cell assist and, coverage between your unit and the gym across the property, things like that. we found them to be very conspicuous by their absence, as we did price, right? Like residents don't mention these features. Same thing with price. Nobody really talks about price in terms of, uh, I am paying too much for the service. We found that the people who talk about price typically talk about price fluctuation. That is, I paid $50 last month, and now I'm paying 85. What is up with that? So they really, again, like reliability across those is really important. And again, like if they do notice things like cell assist, it's happening in the background. These are not the things that matter the most to residents. So what does? And the answer is reliability, right? It is, again, not in the sense of, 3 9s or 5 9s or 6 9s. We found that there were two very clear cut lines in terms of how residents think about reliability, which is if you have less than one outage a month, people think the Wi-Fi is great, as long as it's fast enough. If you have more than one outage a week, then as you'll see in the next slide, like you may as well just escort that resident out of the building today because they're going to leave anyway. And so all of this put together to us finally give us sort of the answer to the question, is Wi-Fi a utility or an amenity? And the answer is it's a utility when it works, i.e. I don't want to think about it, and an amenity when it doesn't, which is, i.e. I paid for it, why is it not working? And so,
One
yeah.
thing that really interests me about because here is where you start to see the
Mhm.
benefit of people being able to answer stuff in their own words, right? If you asked somebody a question about pricing,
Yep.
my bet is they would complain that the thing was too expensive. When you don't ask them that question and you get them to tell you what they think, you discover that the thing that they hate about pricing is when it changes. Which is, again, it's really interesting. It increasingly sounds like something that you want to have control over if you're in the property, because it has a very negative impact on sentiment. The other thing I find that sort of disconnect between 99.9% uptime, which is the kind of thing that a provider would talk about, and the way that a resident thinks about it, which is all to do with frequency of me being inconvenienced. You realize that they're quite different ways of thinking about the same set of things.
Yep, exactly. And so, not to spoil the ending, but when we come back to it, one of the things that Kevin also mentioned is we really want to be thinking about consumer choice across the dimensions that the consumers care about, as
Mhm.
opposed to the way that we think the industry sort of talks about them, because we talk about it in our language, but it's really interesting to start pulling out and teasing out what the consumer language is around this, how they perceive it, because that's ultimately what creates value for the product across the regulatory space, the industry space, and ultimately for our residents. Um, but we'll get there in just a second. So if the first question was, does it matter? We now understand it matters in the sense that it needs to work, and it needs to not be going out all the time. And so when we dive deeper into that to understand how it matters, this is where we get into some really interesting stuff, right? And this is again like an advantage of our methodology, both in terms of being able to tease out the things that matter to residents, and also in being able to sort of triangulate, as you were explaining earlier, Dom, the ability to independently understand how they feel about the Wi-Fi, independently understand how they feel about the renewal, and then because we have access to renewal data, their actual renewal behavior, so we can more reliably correlate them. And so what we find here is something that I'm sure if you ask the customer support team at any network provider, they would tell you immediately. Everybody complains about the same amount, regardless of how they feel about the internet. You'll see here, and we've broken this down by sort of reliable and unreliable internet because that's the dimension that matters. But people will largely complain at about the same rate. About 1 in 5 residents will have something negative to say about the internet service and the Wi-Fi. But the key thing that matters is what they complain about, right? All complaints are not created equal. And this is often lost when we think about sentiment from the perspective of just volume of tickets, right? I'm sure, somebody complaining about not being able to set up their fax machine from 2004 on the latest Wi-Fi is not the same as somebody saying, I cannot, I cannot do my work because
Mhm.
I can't connect to the internet.
Mhm.
And so we are able to tease out, regardless of what the volume of complaints is, what actually matters when we connect it to the to the economic outcome, which is resident renewing or not. And what we find is, of course, just to set the baseline, the average, of course, is our industry has about a 44% churn rate across residents. We find that overall, any Wi-Fi complaint that's not about an outage, right, doesn't impact churn at all, right? And we were astonished by this. Like, we looked at this controlling for everything. Like, we wanted to see if it was more pernicious in one type of asset versus the other, or one type of resident versus the other. Overall, if it works and it's fast enough, it doesn't have an impact on churn. What does have an impact, though, is once they start complaining about outages, right? And this is where those cut lines start to really matter. If there are complaints about outages, they're about 25% more likely to leave. So it jumps from 44 to 58%. And as I was saying before, if you're having one outage a week, which completely makes sense to all of us, I'm sure, like, I couldn't do my job if my internet was out once a week. You may as well just escort them out today, because they're going to leave at a rate of almost 83%. And so this is the thing that matters. Residents complain about Wi-Fi, but they only churn when it doesn't work. And I'll sort of end this slide with a couple interesting things that we're already seeing as we've started sharing this with folks in the industry, right? On the provider side, literally, I think after we gave the talk, a number of them came up and sort of started talking to us about how this is a much better way to start having an informed conversation about what parameters around the service to invest in, right? It's much easier to say Wi-Fi 6E is going to be better for you if you set it up in bulk, because it's going to create redundancy, which means it's going to create fewer outages, than to talk forever about all of the different technical specifications. And then on the flip side, we literally got off a call with one of our customers yesterday. He's going into a negotiation with his service provider, and they're going to talk about this in a much more informed way too. They're going to talk about, what can you give me that's the most reliable? Don't just give me the fastest service. Not that those two things are opposite. And all of that, I want to connect back to Kevin's point, which is, this is ultimately, like, teasing out these dimensions is what ultimately creates the best understanding for the industry and for the consumer, right? So we can all make the best decisions, as opposed to thinking about them from this very broad lens of, either consumer choice or lack of it. It's much more important. The thing that people need to function efficiently in their homes is reliable, fast internet, and that order really matters. It is not the number of logos or not.
So, Kevin, just going back to our earlier conversation, couple of things that sort of jump off the page from what Arjun said so far. One is, reliability can be enough of an issue that people will move house over it. Like, that appears to be one thing that weighs heavily in favor of this is something that you want to make really good and consistent and to manage. The other thing I find fascinating is that nobody complains about price from a value for money perspective, right? So it's very difficult to draw from this sample that anybody thinks they're paying too much money for their Wi-Fi. But they really, really don't like it when you have price changes, which only really happens when you have these multiple retailer environments in a building. What's your reaction to those data points?
I mean, I think they're spot on, and I think there's a lot of synergy between the two of them together, right? People get agitated about paying too much for any consumer product if it's unreliable. And so when you look at just start at reliability, it's, I think, why we've seen the industry shift, especially in the past 5-6 years, to the managed Wi-Fi and increasingly to the bulk models, because you have higher service level agreements in place. You have, better capability to negotiate speeds and service with those providers on behalf of your residents. And I think in this hyper competitive multifamily market where vacancies are low, you cannot risk having unreliable broadband. And I think that's why our members really loved looking at another, angle here on the data and what residents are really pushing for. But I think the price, point that you guys are making here as well, we've long said that to policymakers, that when you look at the choice, multi-provider environment, or you look at the bulk and managed Wi-Fi space, you see a lot of volatility in that consumer market where, consumers will have to navigate, forget about naming names, but they not only have to deal with the credit checks and the equipment rental fees, they have to, deal with the customer service outages on their own. They have to navigate that entire landscape. And so while, it may sound good in theory, in practice, it can be quite a nightmare. So when you talk about reliability and price, oftentimes it is the managed Wi-Fi or bulk route that serves them better.
Yeah. Okay. So let's finish off the last couple of points about findings, Arjun.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what brings that all together is this is really a quest to understand what good looks like across the board, right? What do residents feel is good and therefore will stay for? What is useful information to the tech partners, and what is useful information to our partners as they sort of figure out where to make their investments, right? And so one of the key things, now that we understand why it doesn't matter and how it matters, is we wanted to understand, okay, what do residents actually perceive as good? And unsurprisingly, the words that residents use to describe what good service looks like mirror the biggest ad budgets in the industry, right? They talk about it the same way that fiber providers talk about it. And maybe quick caveat there, we include fiber in the reliable bucket in our previous slide too, because again, they're the only sort of retail solutions that tend to match the stability and speed of our managed or bulk solutions. But this is how they perceive it, and that's why they've been so successful. It is, you'll see here, internet so fast, this must be the future. Bye-bye buffering, right? Like 10x the speed for your business. This is what residents mirror almost one-to-one when they talk about what good looks like. My new internet is 100 times faster. I make a living from home. I'm on video calls all day. I can work when my kids are watching Coco Melon. These are the types of things that residents perceive as good. And one of the key perception gaps that we saw, even with folks who had reliable internet, is obviously if somebody has sort of opted into buying fiber from a retail perspective, they already understand these benefits. And so they have sort of the highest sort of affinity to the quality of service that they're getting, right? Whereas I think one of the things that we as an industry could do way better is we talk to any of our tech marketers, they will tell you managed Wi-Fi and bulk Wi-Fi solve exactly the same problems. However, we talk about it in our words, not theirs. And, the running joke that Dom and I had after looking at these findings was some of our managed Wi-Fi providers might be better off if they just appended fiber to their name. So it's like we talk about these things in these sort of technical terms, but instead, if we just said, it's going to be fast and reliable so you can work from home and your kids can watch their content and nobody's going to have a bad time, like that would be so much more understandable.
It is also in the same light as putting fiber on the name of any product that you're that you're trying to sell. If you think about it from a multifamily community perspective, right? There's a rollout of Wi-Fi services that goes on in a building. This is a wave people can catch, right? Use the same words to describe the service you're moving to that everybody is apparently now used to hearing in from all of these ad channels that have been being pushed on for the last few years. Okay, let's sort of wrap up by talking about some of the broader implications of this, because we focused the conversation on Wi-Fi, but there are some principles in what we've studied that we can generalize to other kinds of research into anything that matters in a multifamily community. So, I mean, let's start off with this concept of separating signal from noise. Arjun, what would you say about that point?
I think again, and this is sort of the biggest difference between an approach like this versus the traditional survey, right? Is I ask you 10 questions at once because it's easy for me to ask 10 questions at once. I have no idea which of those matter to you. I have no idea if you just completed the ones that were easy for you to complete versus the ones that you really cared about. And I don't really have any idea if the things that you say are important to you actually have an outcome that I should be worried about or think about in terms of risk versus benefit. And so to us, what is really important is being able to use the advantages of AI, not just in the ability to let the interviewee lead the conversation, but also then to be able to separate out, yes, 1 in 5 people will have something negative to say about the internet, but the one negative thing that they say that has an impact on churn is actually outages. That to us is I think the broadest opportunity here of sentiment analysis. Again, it's connected to a very old thing, which is this is how you do customer interviews when you're building a product, right? It has just always been hard to scale without the technology. So that's the part that we're so excited about being able to bring that to bear.
I mean, a good general way to think about it is AI is very, very good at finding needles in haystacks, right? So it's
Yeah,
very good about giving people the opportunity to say what specifically they think, and it's then
yeah,
also really good at going through all of these results to figure out what the what the results are. And I think also this idea of having this play out over a period like 90 days. Just gives you more latitude to have a more natural conversation. I mean, if there's a cadence of a day between two answers, that's not a problem, right? If the AI
yeah.
is managing the conversation. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left. Let's just think about this in terms of broader research implications. Actually, before we wrap up on this, Kevin, you're generally looking to partner with companies that can provide insight into stuff that's relevant to your members. What are some of the things that you think about methodologies like these?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, the way I think what really stands out to me in this survey and report or this analysis, and then also the way why our members really loved it at OPTECH was I think it's using tech to find new ways to deliver insights and that they desperately are looking for. So um, we're always on the RETTC and even our parent company NMHC, always looking for new ways to approach data. I think we're seeing AI revolutionize a lot of the processes that we have in house that our members are using, and this is just the latest wrinkles. So looking to see how this advances and really I think disrupts a lot of the approaches that members of ours are taking to impact resident insights and sentiment.
Mhm. So we're going to wrap up with a few sort of principles for future research. So first, we're talking about treating facts as hypotheses, and we've put facts in scare quotes. Why did we do that, Arjun?
It's because we have these, I think, sort of shibboleths in the industry of like what is absolutely important. So again, like you when you talk about how does Wi-Fi matter for outcomes or renewals, right? You want to start with does Wi-Fi matter? Because what you end up doing, even if you end up proving the hypothesis as fact, is you start uncovering a ton of signal about what isn't said, right? Like the fact that people didn't talk much about price is not something that we would have expected unless we went in and asked uh, how people felt about their internet without any preconceived notions. And it actually, and Dom will go through the rest of these, but like this, it actually has a real bearing on the rest of it, which is you're treating it like a true scientific method. In
Mhm.
a survey, you're constrained by having to ask the questions that you want the answers to. In this methodology, you don't have any such constraints. So you just start with like a ground question that sets the truth and then let people lead the conversation. So you're much more likely to uncover uh, things that things that go counter to your thinking or prove them in a scientific way.
Right, and the second point here is following off on the scientific point. Like, there's a skepticism that you can apply to any of the the popular amenities. When we think about how people tend to think about the things that they're going to allocate capital to, they're often going to look at stuff that seems to be popular in their neighborhood. That might be the wrong data point. Why don't you go quickly through the work from home example that you've talked about before?
Yeah, 100%. So Um, we actually did a case study with one of our partners where they were considering a large capex investment into a co-working space. This is a couple years back when we're sort of still in the sort of after effects of the pandemic. And one of the things that we decided to do for them to help them make that decision, which touches all of these, is instead of asking people the traditional way of like, how much would you pay for a co-working space? We rolled it all the way back and then asked, how often do you work from home? And if you do, like, what would make that experience better? And what we ended up finding is while co-working spaces were popular, this is the reason the partner wanted to even make the investment is everybody around them had like review pages that mentioned co-working spaces. When we asked the residents what they wanted to do, they just said, I don't want a co-working space. Half their residents didn't work from home, and the half that did work from home didn't want to sit next to their neighbors when they worked. So instead, they just made a much smaller investment in just having faster internet, right? And so this is the kind of thing, and it's connected to the life cycle piece of this as well. It's the kind of thing where like a co-working space looks fantastic on your website. It looks fantastic on a bunch of Google reviews where a prospect comes in and reviews them. And perhaps it has a ton of value from a marketing standpoint, but making that CapEx investment to hit renewal and rent goals was not going to be it for that partner. And instead, they were able to realize them in a different way by just looking at the problem from another angle.
Yeah, and I mean, it really talks to the last point on here, which is an interesting one, which is the life cycle of the building matters when you think about what you're allocating capital to. If something has a sales and marketing benefit, but no obvious salient value to a resident, that thing might be applicable in the lease up, but is probably much less applicable in a stabilized property. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Just before we go, though, we must give a quick shout out to the sponsors who made this study possible: Dojo Networks, Ruckus Networks, and Gigstream. Thank you very much for your support with this project. Really glad you made it possible, and I think the findings are helpful in terms of moving the conversation forward about the kinds of services that these companies provide. Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in to today's presentation. And one last reminder to download from the website your free copy of the paper, which goes into the topic and the methodology in much more detail. You can download that from the website at 20for20.com/publications. If you liked what you heard today, please give us a 5-star review on the podcasting platform you listened on, or like and subscribe on YouTube. We publish a lot of thought leadership content at 20for20.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our blog. We hope to see you soon.